This is your 2-minute warning. So, as we land the plane on a Friday afternoon, our final speaker for the day is Ronald Rael. Ronald is a designer, activist, trained architect, author, and an Eva Lee Memorial Chair in Architecture at the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests connect indigenous and traditional material practices to contemporary technologies and issues. He's a design activist, author, and thought leader with the topics of additive manufacturing, border wall studies, and earthen architecture. So, I hope you're looking forward to this as much as I am. Ronald, are you there? There you are. The floor is yours.
I am here. Thank you so much for having me. Let me start my presentation here. I want to begin with a beautiful quote that I heard in the Borderlands, que las fronteras nos dividen, pero la tierra nos une. The borders divide us, but the earth unites us. And I'd like to also think of the idea that the borders also have the potential to unite us. And I consider myself a borderland citizen within a larger concept of an expanded borderlands. I am from a very particular and special place called the San Luis Valley, which I believe all of you know. And in fact, my home is right across the road from the Salazar Ranch in the San Luis Valley, just east of Antonito. But the San Luis Valley is a land that is surrounded by 14 and 13,000 foot mountains that border that valley. It crosses the border between the states of Colorado and New Mexico. And it also is the northernmost territory of the Mexican Republic prior to the Mexican-American War, when the border existed right above the San Luis Valley. It also is cut in half by the Rio Grande. The headwaters of the Rio Grande begin there in the San Luis Valley, and they at one time created the border between Texas and secession Texas in the United States, and also connect this historic borderlands with the contemporary borderlands in very vital ways because of this historic watershed. Well, there are several issues that I'm very interested in relating to the contemporary and historic borderlands. And one is the militarization of the historic borderlands and how the architecture of that borderlands was really an architecture of coming together. It's an architecture that takes on the building practices of building traditions that existed in that region for thousands of years. And it's something that I use, that material of earth itself, to unite people, bringing together to learn those traditional, historic, and indigenous practices. In this particular building here, it is a Ute Indian agency that I've been working on for a number of years. This is a workshop for restoring that building in earth. But it's also a site of conflict and turmoil, because the coming together of two places of different languages, of different cultures, of different beliefs, happens in beautiful ways, it happens in remarkable ways, it creates innovation, but it also happens in violent ways. And one of those ways of violence was the separation of children from their families at the historic borderlands and placing those children into bondage and slavery in the borderlands. And on that house, we placed the lists of indigenous children captives that were recorded in the census in 1868 by the Ute Indian agent Lafayette Head to tell that hidden story of child separation in the historic borderlands. Because if there's one thing that I think is really potent, is the idea that if we learn about the traumas and challenges of the historic borderlands, we may begin to rethink the way we consider our contemporary borderlands. In one of my more recent projects, I wanted to create a awareness of child separation at the contemporary borderlands, and I used this sign that is iconic in the borderlands and has a really interesting history in the expanded borderlands. It was designed by a Navajo graphic designer who's working for the California Department of Transportation, and he wanted to create a sign that brought attention to the plight of the migrant today, because he saw that very much related to that of the Navajo during their long walk, during their forced migration. And he did some very interesting things in this sign because of his this relationship he had with the historic and the contemporary borderlands. He used a little girl with pigtails because he thought that's who drivers might empathize with the most. But he used the silhouette of the head of the civil rights leader, Cesar Chavez, as the head of the father. And I wanted to build upon this really brilliant and subversive design activism that was embedded in this sign to make a protest sign during the protests of child separation at the border. And I made one simple move, which is I turned the families to face each other and used the word reunite instead of caution. And I made that sign available for download. Anyone could download it and print it out and use it in protests. And I also embarked on making signs myself that I was going to put up alongside the highway. But it caught the attention of the For Freedoms campaign, which is the largest public art endeavor in the world. And I got to bring that sign back to the highway in a way that I would have never imagined before, which is the form of an enormous giant billboard to be seen by hundreds of thousands of people along the highway to tell the stories of child separation. And perhaps that we should be designing a United States and not a divided States. The sign can also be seen at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine on 110th in Amsterdam, and it continues to be displayed and shown throughout the world to bring awareness to this issue. I also bring people together around Earth in my own home village, which again is right across the road from the Salazar Ranch, my own ancestral home, which was my great-grandfather's. And I teach people how to build with earth, how to build adobes, how to plaster with earth, and I also teach indigenous and traditional foodways around these traditional ovens we call hornos. And I've embarked upon building these hornos along the US-Mexico border in migrant shelters. This particular one is a migrant shelter in Nogales, and a documentary film was made called Pedacito de la Tierra. I'll share that in the chat a little bit later. But it's interesting to think about these hornos as earth that brings people together in beautiful ways, because in a migrant shelter, you have people coming from all over the world, of different cultures, of different languages, but they are all united by food and recipes and stories and the warmth of the fire. And I built these hornos in some really interesting places on a peninsula of private land that juts right into the Trump Winery in Virginia to bring communities together in that landscape. And I'm also working with the American Refugee Committee, now known as ALIGHT, to design inflatable molds that could be shipped to migrant shelters and refugee camps to quickly construct cooking technologies that people can use, again, in fast ways to provide sustenance and warmth and community in those shelters. And this is a prototype that I made here at the University of California. Other comings together are not only of people, communities, of countries, of languages, but also technologies. And during COVID, when we were all separated, I embarked on a project called Casa Covida. Covida sounds like COVID in Spanish, but it doesn't mean COVID in Spanish. And it's more like co-vida, cohabitation, a house for two people that uses additive manufacturing, 3D printing, robotic technologies to 3D print with mud, to imagine ways that we might think of making homes using this very inexpensive and traditional material of the expanded borderlands. And in this building has 3 spaces as a test: a space for sleeping, a space for cooking and warmth, and a space for bathing and gazing up at the sky. These are experimental structures, and some people say, well, don't you need a roof? And so I did some experiments of a new kind of hybridization of bringing together inflatable technologies and earthen structures, like a cherry on top of this giant chocolate sundae. Much of my thinking about the borderlands resulted in a book called Border Walls Architecture, which I consider to be a biography of the border wall that divides the United States from Mexico. And it speaks of the wall of 700 miles of wall constructed at an average of $4 million per mile. And of the stories of separation, of ecological damage, of humanitarian crisis that are caused by what is the largest construction project in 21st century United States. And in that book, I tell these stories of resilience, and I do that through a series of illustrations that I call recuerdos, or souvenirs. These are in the form of postcards and keychains and maps and border games and snow globes. And they're illustrations that bring to light these stories of resistance and resilience. And as souvenirs, they maybe remind us of a time when we built a border wall and what a ridiculous idea that was. And so within there are stories about separation. In this case, the wall cuts off migratory routes of animals to their natural feeding and mating habitats. But it also tells stories of coming together, like these binational yoga classes that used to take place near Friendship Park, near Tijuana and San Diego. I like to think of this yoga pose as the monument pose, because this is the first monument of several hundred that travel between Tijuana and El Paso prior to the militarization and reinforcement of that border with the wall. It also tells stories of how we might negotiate this world of division and coming together. For example, this swing wall where people from two sides could get in and swing over to the other side before gravity deports them to the other side. Or what I call cactus wall, which is not a proposition for creating a border wall out of cactus, but is actually brings to light and calls to attention that the construction of the border wall has destroyed some of our most pristine landscapes in the United States. And what do we do to repair these landscapes? What do we do with this scar that remains? And how do we negotiate and think about how we might reconnect the landscapes, the communities, and the cities that have been severed by the construction of this wall? When Biden took office on his very first day, he put an end to construction of the US-Mexico border wall, leaving hundreds of thousands of tons of steel alongside that border that were yet to be used. And so my design studio was able to smuggle away 10,000 pounds of that steel, not to make a wall of division, but in fact to create a space of coming together. I call this exploration House United, Casa Unida. It's made out of, as I mentioned, 10,000 pounds of steel that were destined to become a wall, and instead create a space of coming together. And after its exhibition at the ASU Art Museum in Tempe, where you can see it currently, it will travel to the shelter in Nogales, Mexico, where I constructed that horno, and be a place where the communities can gather for spiritual reflection. Because in my opinion, the Borderlands aren't two landscapes that are defined by the wall, but it's actually one landscape that's divided by the wall. On one side, it might look like this. Someone's mowing their lawn in their backyard. And then on the other side, the wall is the fourth wall of someone's house. Because the landscape, the border wall not only divides landscapes, it divides nations, cities, neighborhoods, and even children from their families. In my creative practice, I explored this idea through what I call house divided, casa dividida. I drew a series of blueprints in which on the right, you see the average size of a house in El Paso, Texas. On the left, you see the average size of a house in Juarez, Mexico. You see the different construction techniques, the thicknesses of the wall, the size of the wall. But if you look very closely, you'll see that the bedroom is divided in half, including the bed in the bedroom. House Divided explores this idea that we are so close together, but also that we are so far apart and divided. not only in terms of our spaces, our cultures, but it also demonstrates our similarities of culture, of religion, of language. Another example is a house where the kitchen, a dining room, the kitchen and dining room are divided in half, and the wall cuts right through the kitchen table. On the other side of Casa Dividida is the kitchen, and we see again these two worlds so close to each other, but yet so far apart. One of the recuerdos is called Teeter-Totter Wall, and it's a drawing that speaks to the balances and imbalances between labor and trade and migration and wealth and poverty that exist along the border. This is an illustration and a small model that I built back in 2009. And this particular illustration caught a lot of attention. And there was a time when I imagined that perhaps this could be a real proposition. And what would it mean to actually bring such a proposition to the wall? To begin to think about how we might smuggle design to the border wall to bring people together. And just a couple of years ago, I hosted a 40-minute event where I invited communities from both sides to come together, and through the generosity of this simple piece of playground equipment that we call the teeter-totter, that relies upon really the generosity of someone sitting on the other side to give you pleasure, to allow you to have fun. And it enabled us also to tell a different narrative of the Borderlands, that this was not a world where bad hombres are doing bad things in a place where no one lives, but it's a place where women and mothers and grandmothers and children live, where they experience joy every day despite the violence and the oppression of the wall. And we also were able to tell the story that I think is really relevant to this entire conference, which is to recognize that the actions that take place on one side have a direct consequence on the other. Thank you very much.
Boy, Ronald, can you hear me?
I can.
Great, wonderful. Hopefully you heard the applause as well. You showed up at just the right time on a Friday afternoon, my friend. What a presentation of hope and innovation and gathering. We've got questions flowing on our online chat wall, and so I want to bring a couple to you if you have an interest.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you've obviously talked about through all your different work, this is a blending of materials and inspiration and the connection of land and people and place. What first inspired you to do this work? Where did this come from?
Well, I think it came from, I'm going to lower my volume because there's a severe echo. I think it came from growing up as a Borderlands citizen, from always negotiating a cultural crossing between two languages, between different kinds of foods, between different kinds of people. And this is occurring, of course, not at the contemporary US-Mexico border, but at the historic US-Mexico border. And I think confronting that in childhood made me very aware of the differences and also the similarities that are prevalent, and how that as a child growing up in that landscape, you are neither one or the other, and you are something else. You're a mix. You're part of a third nation. And as I got older and I began to travel along the US-Mexico border, I also saw the similarities connected to my own landscape, which seems very far away, but also I could connect to very well. And so moving between those two worlds, I think brought to my attention this connection that is not that exists over a geographic distance, but also a historic distance, and how we might be able to connect those worlds together.
Yeah. You know, I saw eyebrows going up and down in the room when you were mentioning acquiring 10,000 pounds of steel meant for the U.S.-Mexico border fence, and working, you know, with this materials that, you know, weren't necessarily your property, but yet it seems that you've created a conversation through instigation. And so what kind of responses have you received for your work highlighting the borderlands? How do you address negative perspectives or misconceptions about the region? I mean, I would assume that you get, for every good comment you get, you must get a challenging one on the other side.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm going to make a corrective that might also raise some eyebrows, which is, you know, I took materials that aren't mine, although my taxpayer money went to pay for that. And the Borderlands...
You're getting a lot of applause in the room right now.
And so I think as people who have invested in those landscapes, we can decide the destiny of those landscapes. We can choose what the final outcome is. And so that's why we have to vote, and we have to be activists, and we have to speak up to say how we want those borderlands to be. And in fact, many people who will disagree with me are doing the same thing. And so certainly there are comments and responses in favor, and there are responses in opposition. And I get that, because my job isn't trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just trying to call attention to what I think is an extremely important set of issues that we are repeating 100 and some years later.
You know, as we close out our 2 days together on a Friday afternoon, I'm going to end with this question, because I think it's a relevant place to end. But so no pressure. You look at all of these challenging topics and working with materials that are wild and unpredictable, and a topic that is wild and unpredictable. And in the middle of all of this, you somehow seem to find a way to create beauty, and in my translation of that, hope. How do you translate the possibility that's in front of us for making things better through the medium of art and, I guess, the expression of that art?
Thanks for that question. You know, there's you or the person asking the question used these this adjective, the wild materials, and in fact, I think they're very controlled materials. If you're talking about mud, for example, earth is the building material that we as humans have been learning about, figuring out, and domesticating for 10,000 years, more than any other material on the planet. And so in many ways, it's the material we have most control of. There are traditions all over the planet, and in Colorado and Texas, throughout the expanded borderlands, throughout Mexico, on every single continent except for one, where humans have built beautiful materials, beautiful homes out of mud. And I think that tells us a powerful lesson that we as humans can do more with less. And I think just to answer the question, and it's an optimistic question about hope, is that perhaps the solutions to considering the border aren't to invest $49 billion in a thin steel wall, but to think about how we can invest in the borderlands as a cultural and ecological endeavor.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Ronald.
Thank you.
Lots of applause here. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, what does everybody think? Are you inspired? A little scared? but filled with hope, then that's the right place to be. Beth, any closing thoughts?
I don't know. Is this live? Yeah. Just thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being part of this. It was very touching for me after, in 3 years, to have people gather again to share ideas and challenge ourselves around some of these issues. So I'm really grateful to everybody for being here and look forward to following up and seeing you next year, hopefully. Thanks. And thank you, Luis.
Travel safe, go with heart. Thank you for coming.